It's not exactly a startling insight that when we look at the life of Jesus, we see that he and the religious establishment of his day did not mix all that well. Again and again in the Gospels, we see him in some kind of conflict with the Pharisees or the scribes or the priests of his day, or at least most of them that are recorded for us in the Gospels. And as you look at these encounters that he has with the religious establishment, there seems to be kind of a pattern, a kind of a move from curiosity about Jesus to arguments with Jesus to the desire to discredit Jesus to the desire to kill Jesus. And there's a story of Jesus in Jerusalem in John's gospel that happens around stages 3 and 4 on that continuum. This is chapter 8 in John's gospel, and Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's having this exchange with Pharisees there. And at some point in the exchange, he says, "Those who keep my word will never see death." Those who keep my word will never see death. And the Pharisees respond to this by saying, "Who do you think you are? I mean, our father Abraham died. The prophets died. Are you saying that you are greater than Abraham?" And Jesus responds, "Truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Blasphemy in their eyes. Why does Jesus respond in this way? Before Abraham was, I am. Well, to get the context around the answer to that question, we go all the way back to one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible that you've just heard this morning, the story of Moses and the burning bush. The story is simply this: God calls Moses out of obscurity. In fact, he's a fugitive at the time of his calling. And he says, "Moses, I want you to be my emissary to go to the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him to let my people go. The people of Israel are to be released by him from their slavery in Egypt." And Moses, like you and I would respond, goes, "Who are you talking to? Me? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? And what am I going to say to the people of Israel when I go before him and say, hey, I've been appointed to go and speak for all of us? Who sent me?" God says, "You tell them I am sent you." And I think you know this, I am. The word for God in the Hebrew scriptures, the holiest, most powerful word there is, and really not even meant to be a word, spelled out with consonants only, without the vowels, so we can't even utter the name, it is so holy, YHWH in English. Of course, we have added the vowels, Yahweh will come to be known to us also as Jehovah. With this, and I'm only scratching the surface of the depth of this word, but what it is trying to communicate is that our God is so awesome, so holy, the source of everything that is, that you better be very careful before you start to talk about him, lest you not know what you're talking about. And Jesus says, centuries later, in that exchange in John's gospel with the Pharisees in Jerusalem, I am. That's who I am. I'm the same one who spoke way back then to Moses. So let's take a little closer look at this story of the burning bush. Again, Moses is a fugitive. He's committed a crime, a murder. He's out in the wilderness of the Sinai, taking refuge under the wing of his father-in-law. He's looking after his father-in-law's flocks. Just one random day, he spies out of the corner of his eye a bush that is aflame. It's on fire, but it's not burning up. He begins to pay closer attention. This startling curiosity is exceeded by the fact that now the bush speaks to him. He hears words coming from it. Let's just hear again these verses. Moses said, "I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here am I." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet. For the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. What I find really interesting about this story, actually this part of the story, because we could spend a long time unpacking the entirety of what you heard earlier, is that at the same time, Moses is irresistibly drawn to God in the bush and afraid at the same time. He sort of can't look away, and yet he's afraid. And so what I'd like us to do is just to spend a little time in your hearts and your minds as we reflect on this passage, this paradoxical spiritual state of being fearful of the Lord and yet drawn to the Lord at the same time. And I'm going to focus on a couple of symbols in the story. But what I really want to say, put this under the umbrella of this gets to our image of God. And I know I talk about this a lot, but the state of your spiritual life right this minute, your capacity to grow in your relationship to God will be deeply, deeply, deeply formed by the image that you have of God. I've always loved this quotation from Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor that I read years ago. And she said that when she was in Sunday school growing up in the church as a little girl, she learned that the appropriate image of God was he was an elderly, white-haired man sitting on a throne in heaven who occasionally bent over and stirred creation with a stick. I think that's a lot of people's idea. Our image of God is critically important again. And I'm not a counselor professionally or a psychiatrist or psychologist, but my pastoral experience is that our image of God is formed very, very early in life. Not irrevocably so, but very early from parental figures, present or absent, loving or not loving, from authority figures in our lives, including authority figures in the life of the church, from life experiences, blessings, as well as bad things and tragedies and accidents that happen to us, and just our unique psychological and emotional makeup. And I think that, broadly speaking, we tend in one of two directions. On the one hand, God is just kind of a vague, benevolent spirit. You can use the image of sort of the elderly, white-haired, maybe your grandfather who would come to visit you every now and then if you had one like this growing up, and, you know, just always like, there, you're a good boy, you're a good girl. Affirming everything. God is love, God is love, God is love. Not wrong, but not well balanced, because then there's over here on the other extreme, this idea that God is mainly to be feared, that God is probably not happy with me. God is displeased with me. God doesn't like me, disapproving, rejecting. God is scary. I don't want to really think about God too much that way. And I think both of these are a way of keeping God kind of at a distance, not really holding together sort of the fierceness of God's love against anything and everything in our lives that separate us from the love of God, but at the same time, not really trusting that at God's essential being and heart is mercy and grace. So to continue to reflect on this, I want to just pull out two symbols from the story. And the first of these is obviously the fire. Why fire? It's an image that you find throughout the Bible, of course, but it's especially prominent in the book of Exodus. The central narrative in the whole book of Exodus happens between the call of Moses, then you have, everything unfolds, the people of Israel are liberated, the Exodus event, and then God descends on the Mount of Sinai for the giving of the law. So the call of Moses, the giving of the law, the covenant are framed by fire. And again, it's meant to represent sort of the awesome holiness of God that is purifying, that wants to burn away anything and everything that separates us from the love of God. And we talk about this sometimes as the fear of the Lord. But is it this kind of fear over here where God doesn't like me, God is upset with me, God's ticked off at me? really appreciate an Irish biblical scholar from the 20th century, Alec Motyer, who says that when we come across this image and when we think about fear of the Lord, it's not so much that we should be afraid of God, but rather that when we realize God is near, we look at our own lives. And what we're really afraid of is what would it look like if we lived an entirely different life, utterly given over to God? Because we've made accommodation with the way we're currently living. And it can be scary to think about what it would mean if God truly did take us deeper into his heart of love. What would change about us? And that is scary. I know I mentioned last month in a sermon here, a little story about my brother Bill, who died in 2010 from his addictions. And it was exactly 20 years ago, in 2005, in March, in Lent. I called him on a Saturday afternoon to talk to him and just catch up, and he was currently living in a halfway house. At that point, he'd been sober for 6 months, and he was doing really well. And we talked for a while, and he started sharing some things with me, and I was so touched by what he shared that I said, Bill, would you mind if I mention this in my sermon tomorrow? He said, you can share my Social Security number, really. This is what he was talking about. He goes, there's a reason there are usually a lot of people at AA meetings, at least the AA meetings that I go to. He said, most of us who come to these AA meetings, we've stopped drinking. We're not drinking at the moment. And the easy thing for us would be to just go back to drinking. We got that down. I really got very used to that. He said, but we're there to try to live a whole new life. And that is the scariest thing in the world for us, for me. And for that, I need God and I need community. And that's why we go to AA. And I thought, I don't think I can imagine a better image for the church at her best than an AA meeting. We need one another and we need God to live fully into the people that we're being called to be, rather than to fall back on our addictions and our patterns that separate us from the love of God. Fear of the Lord in that sense. The second symbol I want to point out is the voice from the bush says, take off your sandals. Take your shoes off, Moses. You're on holy ground. As you probably know, shoes down through time universally are regarded as symbolically unclean. Israel's priests, when they would go into the sanctuary in the temple, would take their sandals off to be barefoot. Don't go in a mosque in Islam with your shoes on. And the reason they are symbolically unclean is because shoes touch the ground. They literally touch dirt with each and every step. And so we want to remove anything like dirt, any uncleanness getting between us and God. But we also wear shoes because they protect our feet, right? And what that actually does is also desensitizes us to what is under our feet. I remember when I was a kid growing up in Virginia, at our home, we had a circular driveway, these little pebbles. And, come around late May, take my shoes off as a little boy and run around for about the next 4 months. In the first weeks of being barefoot, after a whole fall and winter of wearing shoes, you're like, ow, ow, ow. You go across the pebbles. And then by September, you're just sprinting right through it. Take your shoes off so we realize, I feel it. I'm in the presence of God. God wants us to understand the ground of his being and not to lose our sensitivity, again, to his holiness, which includes his love. So this is obviously the season we call Lent. It's a season that calls us into honest self-examination, to ask of ourselves hard questions, and to be reminded that ours is an awesome God, holy, mighty, purifying, fiercely opposed to anything in our lives that separates us from God or desensitizes us. And do we want to come close to this God? Do we want this God to come close to us? to speak out of the fire of his burning love, and to trust God enough to let him burn away our slavery to sin. Because God sees it even before we see it ourselves. God says to Moses, I have seen the affliction of my people. I've seen it, whether you're fully appreciating it or not, and I'm coming to do something about it. And he does in Moses, in the ensuing stories, and he does it obviously climactically in the person of Jesus. Last Sunday, and Steve, I appreciate that you pick out these gospel songs that we sing when we're taking communion. We sang It Is Well With My Soul, one of my favorites. And in verse 2, there's a great line. It says, my sin not in part, but the whole is nailed to the cross. I know sometimes I'm nervy enough to come to God and say, would you take care of some of these fringe elements in my life? I'm kind of find it easy to live with the core, as I'm already living it with these patterns that include a lot of sin in them. But if you tidy up around the edges, no, my whole life, not in part, but my whole. Moses is about to get a whole new life, not just an extra chore to do. Is it scary for him? You bet. You bet. But it is the life for which he was created. Life utterly transcendent to God and utterly trusting, come what may. We're told that the fire and the voice from the bush is a messenger of God. It's God speaking. I am. And Jesus says centuries later again, that is I. I am, I am. Not speaking anymore out of a flame and a bush, but as the Word made flesh, who loves you and loves you literally to death. So how do we calibrate well fear of the Lord with a gracious and always loving image of God? Well, we have our answer. We look continually to Jesus and his cross, and to there we will continue our journey. Amen.